In the darkest chapter of human history, something unexpected happened. German soldiers, SS officers, and Nazi party members found themselves facing an impossible choice when they fell in love with the very women their regime had marked for destruction. These were not simple love stories. These were life-or-death decisions that tested the limits of human conscience, survival instinct, and the power of love itself. Some chose love over loyalty to the Reich. Others succumbed to the pressure of ideology, with devastating consequences. What happened to these men when their personal feelings collided with the most systematic campaign of hatred in modern history? The Nazi regime's racial laws, implemented systematically beginning in 1935, created a legal and social framework that made relationships between Germans and Jews not just forbidden, but punishable by imprisonment, social ostracism, and in many cases, death. The Nuremberg laws specifically prohibited marriages and extramarital relations between Jews and citizens of German blood. Yet human emotions proved remarkably resistant to political decree. Consider the case of Lieutenant Colonel Karl Plog, a Wehrmacht officer stationed in Lithuania. Plog commanded a vehicle repair unit in Vilnius where he employed Jewish workers from the local ghetto. Among these workers was a young Jewish woman named Bella, who had been a university student before the war. Initially, their relationship was strictly professional. She worked as a translator and administrative assistant in his unit. Over months of working together, Plog began to see past the dehumanizing propaganda he had been fed. Bella's intelligence, dignity, and humanity challenged everything he had been taught about Jewish people. Their conversations gradually moved from work matters to literature, philosophy, and their hopes for the future. What began as professional respect slowly transformed into something deeper. Plog faced an excruciating dilemma. His growing feelings for Bella occurred against the backdrop of increasingly violent anti-Jewish measures. He witnessed the gradual destruction of the Vilnius ghetto, the deportations, and the systematic elimination of the Jewish population. Every day brought new horrors, and every day he was expected to participate in, or at least tacitly support, these actions. The weight of his position created an unbearable tension. As a German officer, he was expected to be a model of racial purity and ideological commitment. Yet his feelings for Bella made him question not just the regime's policies, but his own complicity in them. He began to use his position to protect Jewish workers in his unit, providing them with better working conditions, additional food, and warnings about impending actions. But protection could only go so far. As the situation deteriorated, Plog was forced to confront the ultimate question. Would he risk everything to save the woman he loved, or would he prioritize his own survival and that of his family back in Germany? The psychological toll of this internal conflict was immense. German soldiers and officers who found themselves in similar situations often described feeling completely isolated, unable to confide in their comrades or superiors about their emotional struggles. They lived in constant fear of discovery, knowing that any hint of their feelings could result in court-martial, disgrace, and severe punishment. What made these situations even more complex was the power dynamic involved. These were not relationships between equals, they were relationships between oppressor and oppressed, between those with life and death authority and those whose very existence hung in the balance. Yet somehow, in some cases, genuine human connection managed to transcend even these impossible circumstances. The case of Wehrmacht Captain Franz Dietrich in occupied Ukraine provides another example of this agonizing moral conflict. Dietrich commanded a supply unit in Kiev, where he encountered Anna Petrova, a Jewish woman who had been working as a translator for the German administration. Anna had managed to conceal her Jewish identity by obtaining false papers, identifying her as a Ukrainian Orthodox Christian. Dietrich initially valued Anna for her linguistic skills and her ability to navigate the complex cultural landscape of occupied Ukraine. She spoke fluent German, Russian, and Ukrainian, making her invaluable for communication with local officials and civilians. Over time, their professional relationship evolved into something more personal. Anna's intelligence and resilience impressed Dietrich deeply. Despite the dangerous circumstances, she maintained her dignity and continued to help other Jews in the area whenever possible. She would warn them about impending raids, help them obtain false documents, and provide them with information about safe houses and escape routes. As Dietrich learned more about Anna's background and activities, he found himself in an impossible position. He was falling in love with a woman who was not only Jewish, but also actively engaged in resistance activities. Every day, he witnessed her courage and compassion, qualities that challenged everything he had been taught about racial hierarchy and Jewish character. The situation became even more complicated when Dietrich realized that Anna knew he was aware of her true identity. She had been carefully observing his reactions and had concluded that he posed no immediate threat to her safety. This mutual awareness created an unspoken understanding between them, but it also intensified the moral pressure on both sides. Dietrich began to experience severe psychological distress as he struggled to reconcile his feelings with his duty as a German officer. He found himself questioning not just the regime's policies toward Jews, but the entire ideological framework that had shaped his worldview. The woman he loved embodied everything the Nazi regime claimed to despise, yet she was clearly more intelligent, compassionate, and morally courageous than many of his fellow officers. The internal conflict affected Dietrich's performance as an officer. He became increasingly distracted, made errors in judgment, and began to avoid social interactions with his colleagues. His superiors noticed his declining performance but attributed it to combat stress rather than a personal crisis. The breaking point came when Dietrich learned that Anna's false identity had been discovered by the local Gestapo. Her arrest was scheduled for the following morning, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it through official channels. He faced the same impossible choice that had confronted Plaga: risk everything to save the woman he loved, or prioritize his own survival and career. Dietrich's decision revealed the depths of his moral transformation. He chose to warn Anna about the impending arrest, giving her a chance to escape. He provided her with money, supplies, and contact information for partisan groups that might help her reach safety. His actions were driven not just by love, but by a fundamental shift in his moral compass that made him willing to risk everything for what he believed was right. The consequences of Dietrich's choice were swift and severe. Anna's escape was discovered within hours, and the investigation quickly led back to him. He was arrested, court-martialed, and sentenced to death for treason. Anna managed to reach partisan-controlled territory, where she survived the remainder of the war, but she never learned of Dietrich's fate until after the war ended. These cases demonstrate the extraordinary psychological pressure faced by German men who found themselves emotionally connected to Jewish women. The Nazi regime's systematic dehumanization of Jews created a cognitive dissonance that became unbearable when confronted with the reality of individual human relationships. The men who experienced this conflict were forced to choose between the abstract ideology they had been taught and the concrete reality of their personal experiences. The next chapter reveals how some of these men chose to act on their feelings and the extraordinary lengths they went to in order to protect the women they loved. When love collided with genocide, some men chose to risk everything. Their stories reveal the extraordinary measures people will take when faced with the potential loss of someone they cherish above all else. In occupied Poland, SS Unterscharführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, not to be confused with the higher-ranking Nazi official of the same name, served in a unit responsible for ghetto administration in Krakow. Among the Jewish residents was Rachel Goldstein, a young woman who had been a medical student before the war. Their paths crossed when she was assigned to work in the administrative offices where Kaltenbrunner was stationed. Rachel possessed a remarkable ability to remain composed under pressure, and her medical knowledge made her valuable to the German administration. Kaltenbrunner initially appreciated her competence and professionalism. Over time, their interactions became more personal. She would share stories about her interrupted medical studies, her family, and her dreams of returning to university after the war. He found himself drawn to her intelligence and quiet strength. As the situation in the Krakow ghetto deteriorated, Kaltenbrunner made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He began to systematically forge documents that would allow Rachel to survive the periodic selections and deportations. Using his position and access to official stamps and paperwork, he created false employment records, medical exemptions, and other documents that kept her name off the deportation lists. The forged documents were just the beginning. Kaltenbrunner started smuggling food, medicine, and other supplies to Rachel and her family. He used his knowledge of upcoming actions to warn them when to hide or relocate within the ghetto. Each act of assistance required careful planning and nerves of steel. A single mistake could have exposed not only his activities, but also endangered Rachel further. The most dangerous moment came in March 1943, when Rachel's name appeared on a list for deportation to Auschwitz. Kaltenbrunner knew that this time, no amount of paperwork would save her. He made a desperate decision: He would help her escape from the ghetto entirely. Using his authority, he arranged for Rachel to be included in a work detail that would take her outside the ghetto walls. At a predetermined moment, she would disappear from the group. He had prepared false identity papers identifying her as a Polish Catholic woman, complete with a fabricated personal history that would withstand casual scrutiny. The escape plan required split-second timing and absolute trust. Rachel would have to abandon her family, knowing she might never see them again. Kaltenbrunner would have to live with the knowledge that his actions, if discovered, would result in his own death and potentially retaliation against other Jews in the ghetto. On the appointed day, the plan worked. Rachel vanished from the work detail and, using her new identity, made her way to a safe house that Kaltenbrunner had arranged through contacts in the Polish underground. For the remainder of the war, she lived as a Polish Catholic woman, working as a domestic servant in a household outside Krakow. Kaltenbrunner's transformation from Nazi functionary to active resistor didn't end with Rachel's escape. Her courage and dignity had fundamentally changed his worldview. He began to use his position to help other Jews escape, always operating carefully to avoid detection. By the war's end, he had helped nearly 30 people survive the Holocaust. But not all such stories ended with successful escapes. In Hamburg, Gestapo agent Friedrich Weber developed feelings for Sarah Klein, a Jewish woman who worked as a seamstress in a factory that produced uniforms for the German military. Weber had been assigned to monitor the factory for signs of sabotage or resistance activity. Weber's attraction to Sarah began as mere physical interest, but evolved into something deeper as he observed her quiet acts of kindness toward fellow workers and her refusal to be broken by the increasingly harsh conditions. He began to find excuses to visit the factory more frequently, always ensuring their conversations appeared work-related. As anti-Jewish measures intensified, Weber tried to use his position to protect Sarah. He removed her name from arrest lists, delayed investigations that might have implicated her, and provided warnings about impending raids. However, his activities eventually attracted the attention of his superiors. In late 1942, Weber's commanding officer began to suspect his unusual interest in protecting certain Jewish workers. Weber found himself under surveillance, his activities monitored by fellow Gestapo agents. The pressure became unbearable when he learned that Sarah was scheduled for deportation, and this time, he lacked the influence to prevent it. Weber made a final, desperate gambit. He approached Sarah with a proposal. He would arrange for her to be declared dead in official records, allowing her to assume a new identity and disappear. The plan required her to fake her own death during transport to a concentration camp, with Weber's help to ensure she could escape during the chaos. The plan failed catastrophically. Weber's surveillance had been more thorough than he realized. When he attempted to implement the escape, he and Sarah were both arrested. Weber was court-martialed for treason and executed. Sarah was sent to Bergen-Belsen, where she perished in early 1945. These cases of desperate courage reveal the extraordinary lengths some men went to protect the women they loved, but they also highlight the terrible price of resistance in a totalitarian system. The next chapter explores what happened to those who chose a different path, those who tried to navigate the impossible terrain between love and loyalty to the regime. Not every German who fell in love with a Jewish woman chose the path of resistance. Some attempted to find middle ground, trying to reconcile their personal feelings with their allegiance to the Nazi state. These stories reveal the devastating psychological toll of attempting to serve two masters, love and ideology. Dr. Hans Kruger, a physician and SS officer, encountered this impossible dilemma in the Warsaw Ghetto. Kruger had been assigned to medical duties in the ghetto as part of the Nazi administration's efforts to monitor and control the Jewish population. His official role was to oversee medical procedures and ensure that disease outbreaks didn't spread beyond the ghetto walls. Among the Jewish medical staff working under his supervision was Dr. Miriam Rosenberg, a talented surgeon who had been stripped of her official credentials but continued to practice medicine clandestinely to help ghetto residents. Kruger was immediately impressed by her medical knowledge and her ability to perform complex procedures under the most primitive conditions. Their professional relationship gradually evolved into something more personal. Kruger found himself staying late in the makeshift medical facilities, ostensibly to review procedures, but actually to spend time talking with Miriam. She spoke about her medical training in Berlin, her research interests, and her frustration at being unable to help more people given the severe shortage of medical supplies. Kruger began to rationalize his growing feelings by telling himself that he was simply recognizing exceptional talent. He convinced himself that his appreciation for Miriam's abilities was purely professional, even as he found himself thinking about her constantly and looking for excuses to see her. As their relationship deepened, Kruger attempted to reconcile his feelings with his Nazi ideology through a series of increasingly elaborate mental gymnastics. He told himself that Miriam was different from other Jews, that she was somehow exceptional, an anomaly that proved the rule rather than challenged it. He developed a personal mythology in which his feelings for her were compatible with his broader beliefs about racial hierarchy. This internal compromise allowed Kruger to continue his duties while also providing special protection for Miriam. He ensured she received better food rations, access to medical supplies, and protection from the worst abuses. He convinced himself that this preferential treatment was justified by her medical value to the ghetto administration. However, Kruger's attempts at compromise became increasingly untenable as the situation in the Warsaw Ghetto deteriorated. The mass deportations that began in July 1942 forced him to confront the ultimate implications of his ideological allegiance. He knew that Miriam, like all other ghetto residents, was destined for deportation and likely death. When the deportations began, Kruger faced a moment of truth. He had the authority to exempt certain individuals deemed essential to ghetto operations, but using this power to save Miriam would have required him to explicitly choose her over his duty to the regime. Instead, he chose a path of willful blindness, convincing himself that the deportations were temporary relocations and that Miriam would be safe. Kruger's self-deception allowed him to avoid making the hard choice between love and loyalty, but it came at a terrible cost. He provided Miriam with false reassurances about her safety, telling her that her medical skills would protect her from deportation. He genuinely believed, or forced himself to believe, that his feelings for her were somehow compatible with the broader Nazi project. When Miriam was finally selected for deportation, Kruger experienced a complete psychological breakdown. The elaborate rationalization he had constructed to reconcile his love with his ideology collapsed in an instant. He realized that his attempts at compromise had been nothing more than cowardice, a refusal to acknowledge the true nature of the regime he served. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. Kruger suffered what would today be recognized as a severe mental health crisis. He began drinking heavily, became increasingly erratic in his duties, and showed signs of severe depression. His colleagues noted his deteriorating condition, but attributed it to the stress of working in the ghetto rather than to his personal crisis. Kruger's case illustrates the psychological impossibility of serving both love and a genocidal ideology. His attempts to find middle ground ultimately satisfied neither his conscience nor his duty, leaving him in a state of perpetual internal conflict that proved unsustainable. Similar patterns emerged in other cases where German officials attempted to compartmentalize their feelings. Major Wilhelm Hosenfeld, who served in occupied Poland, developed deep respect and affection for several Jewish individuals he encountered, including pianist Władysław Szpilman. However, unlike Kruger, Hosenfeld eventually resolved his internal conflict by choosing to actively resist the regime, using his position to help Jews escape and survive. The contrast between Kruger and Hosenfeld highlights the ultimate futility of attempting to serve both love and genocide. Those who tried to find middle ground often found themselves psychologically destroyed by the attempt, while those who chose decisive action, whether in favor of love or ideology, at least achieved internal consistency, even if at great personal cost. The question of what drove some men toward resistance, while others chose compromise, leads us to examine the most tragic category of all, those who ultimately chose ideology over love, and the devastating consequences that followed. Perhaps the most heartbreaking stories are those of men who, despite genuine feelings for Jewish women, ultimately chose loyalty to the Nazi regime over love. These cases reveal the devastating power of ideological indoctrination and social pressure, even in the face of the most intimate human connections. Captain Heinrich Müller, a Wehrmacht officer stationed in occupied France, represents one of the most tragic examples of this phenomenon. Müller had been a career military officer before the war, rising through the ranks based on his tactical abilities and leadership skills. His assignment to occupied France initially seemed routine. He was responsible for coordinating logistics and maintaining order in a relatively quiet sector. In the small French town where he was stationed, Muller encountered Elise Dumont, a young Jewish woman who had been passing as a French Catholic since the German occupation began. Elise worked as a librarian in the town's library, which Muller frequented due to his love of literature and history. Their conversations began with discussions about books and gradually evolved into deeper conversations about life, philosophy, and their hopes for the future. Muller was completely unaware of Elise's Jewish identity during the early months of their relationship. He saw her as an intelligent, cultured French woman who shared his intellectual interests. Their relationship developed naturally, progressing from friendship to romantic attachment over the course of several months. The revelation of Elise's true identity came through a denunciation by a local collaborator who had suspected her background. When Muller learned that the woman he had fallen in love with was Jewish, he experienced a profound psychological crisis. Everything he had been taught about racial hierarchy and Jewish characteristics seemed to be contradicted by his personal experience with Elise. Initially, Muller attempted to reconcile this contradiction by convincing himself that Elise was somehow different, that her intelligence, beauty, and cultural sophistication made her an exception to the racial theories he had been taught. He tried to maintain their relationship while also fulfilling his military duties, hoping to find a way to protect her without compromising his position. However, the pressure from his superiors and peers proved overwhelming. When Elise's identity was officially discovered, Muller faced an immediate choice. He could either denounce her and prove his loyalty to the regime, or he could attempt to protect her and risk court-martial for racial defilement and treason. The decision Muller made reveals the terrible power of social and ideological pressure. Despite his genuine feelings for Elise, he chose to turn her over to the authorities. He convinced himself that his duty to the fatherland took precedence over his personal feelings, and that his military oath required him to put service above personal desire. Muller's rationalization process was both elaborate and tragic. He told himself that his feelings for Elise had been based on deception, that she had manipulated him by concealing her true identity. He convinced himself that his attraction to her was somehow shameful, a weakness that threatened his honor as a German officer. In his final conversation with Elise before her arrest, Muller attempted to justify his decision by explaining that he had to choose between his duty to Germany and his personal feelings. He told her that he hoped she would understand that his obligations as a soldier required him to put service above personal desire. Elise's response was one of quiet dignity. She told him that she understood his position, but that she had hoped love might prove stronger than hatred. The psychological aftermath of Muller's decision was devastating. Even though he had chosen ideology over love, he found no peace in his choice. His guilt over betraying Elise consumed him, leading to increasingly erratic behavior and deteriorating military performance. He began drinking heavily and became withdrawn from his fellow officers. Muller's case was complicated by the fact that he continued to serve in the same town where Elise had been arrested. He was forced to witness the consequences of his decision as the local Jewish population was systematically rounded up and deported. Every day brought reminders of his betrayal, and every day his psychological condition deteriorated further. The final tragedy of Muller's story came near the end of the war, when he learned that Elise had perished in Auschwitz. The news triggered a complete mental breakdown. He was found by his orderly, having taken his own life in his quarters. His suicide note, discovered by Allied forces after the war, revealed the full extent of his psychological torment and his regret over choosing ideology over love. A similar pattern emerged in the case of SS Obersturmführer Kurt Waldheim, who served in Yugoslavia during the partisan wars. Waldheim developed a relationship with Anna Maric, a Jewish woman who had joined the partisan resistance after her family was killed in early anti-Jewish measures. Their relationship developed during a period when Waldheim was tasked with anti-partisan operations in the mountains of Yugoslavia. The relationship between Waldheim and Anna was particularly complex because she was not only Jewish, but also an active member of the resistance. Their meetings occurred during brief ceasefires and prisoner exchanges, situations that allowed for limited personal interaction despite their opposing roles in the conflict. Waldheim's feelings for Anna created an impossible situation. He was simultaneously fighting against the resistance movement she belonged to while developing romantic feelings for her. The contradiction between his military duties and his personal feelings created severe psychological stress that affected his ability to function as an officer. When Anna was finally captured during a partisan raid, Waldheim faced the same choice as Müller. He could either use his position to protect her or fulfill his duty to the regime. Unlike Müller, however, Waldheim's decision was complicated by the fact that Anna was not just Jewish, but also a resistance fighter, making any attempt to protect her an act of treason on multiple levels. Waldheim ultimately chose to follow orders, participating in Anna's interrogation and providing information that led to the capture of other resistance members. His rationalization was that his military oath required absolute obedience, and that personal feelings could not be allowed to interfere with the war effort. The psychological impact of this decision was immediately apparent. Waldheim suffered what his comrades described as a nervous breakdown, becoming unable to perform his duties effectively. He was eventually transferred to a rear area assignment, officially due to combat fatigue, but actually because his psychological condition had made him unreliable in combat situations. Another devastating case occurred in occupied Denmark, where SS Hauptsturmführer Erik Larsen developed a relationship with Ingrid Abrahamsen, a Jewish woman who worked as a nurse in a Copenhagen hospital. Denmark's relatively lenient occupation policies initially allowed Jewish residents to maintain more normal lives than in other occupied countries, creating opportunities for relationships that would have been impossible elsewhere. Larsen met Ingrid when he was hospitalized for treatment of a minor injury sustained during a training exercise. Ingrid's professionalism and kindness during his treatment impressed him, and he began to visit the hospital regularly under various pretexts in order to see her. Their relationship developed gradually, with Larsen initially unaware of Ingrid's Jewish background. When the German authorities decided to implement the final solution in Denmark in October 1943, Larsen learned of Ingrid's Jewish identity through official deportation lists. The discovery created an immediate crisis for him, as he realized that the woman he had fallen in love with was scheduled for deportation within days. Larsen's response to this crisis revealed the depth of his indoctrination and the power of peer pressure within the SS. Despite his genuine feelings for Ingrid, he convinced himself that his duty as an SS officer required him to support the deportation measures. He rationalized his decision by telling himself that personal feelings were a weakness that could not be allowed to interfere with the greater good of the German people. The most tragic aspect of Larsen's case was his decision to personally inform Ingrid of her impending deportation. He convinced himself that this was an act of mercy, giving her time to prepare for what he presented as a temporary relocation to a work camp. In reality, he was condemning her to death while maintaining the illusion that he was being compassionate. Ingrid's response to Larsen's revelation was one of quiet dignity, mixed with profound disappointment. She had suspected his true feelings and had hoped that love might prove stronger than ideology. Her calm acceptance of her fate, combined with her expression of pity for his moral cowardice, created a psychological wound that would haunt Larsen for the rest of his life. The implementation of the deportation in Denmark was largely unsuccessful due to widespread Danish resistance, but Ingrid was among the small number of Jews who were captured and deported. Larsen's knowledge of her fate, combined with his role in her capture, created a psychological burden that destroyed his ability to function as an officer. Larsen's case was particularly tragic because the Danish resistance had offered him the opportunity to help protect Jewish residents, including Ingrid. Several German officers in Denmark had chosen to provide warnings and assistance to Jews, allowing many to escape to Sweden. Larsen's decision to support the deportation, rather than resist it, represented a conscious choice of ideology over love, with devastating consequences for both himself and Ingrid. The psychological aftermath of these decisions, to choose ideology over love, followed remarkably similar patterns. The men involved experienced immediate guilt and regret, followed by deteriorating mental health and declining performance in their official duties. Even when they convinced themselves that duty required them to betray the women they loved, they found no peace in their choice. These cases of men who chose ideology over love reveal the devastating psychological cost of such decisions. Even when they convinced themselves that duty required them to betray the women they loved, they found no peace in their choice. The guilt and regret that followed often proved more destructive than the original moral conflict. But what of those who found ways to successfully navigate this impossible terrain? The final chapter explores the rare cases where love and survival found a way to coexist even in the darkest of times. In the midst of systematic genocide, a few extraordinary stories emerged of German men who successfully protected the Jewish women they loved, managing to navigate the deadly landscape of Nazi-occupied Europe while preserving both their lives and their relationships. These cases reveal the remarkable ingenuity, courage, and persistence required to protect love in the face of absolute evil. The most remarkable case may be that of Major Otto Schultz, a Wehrmacht logistics officer stationed in Belgium. Schultz met Rebecca Goldberg in Brussels in 1941 when she was working as a seamstress in a shop that provided alterations for German military uniforms. Rebecca had been passing as a Belgian Catholic since the German occupation began, using forged papers that identified her as Marie Dubois. Schultz initially knew Rebecca only as Marie, the skilled seamstress who handled his uniform alterations. Their relationship developed slowly over months of regular visits to her shop. Schultz was impressed by her intelligence, her knowledge of literature and music, and her ability to discuss complex topics despite her supposedly limited education as a working-class seamstress. The truth about Rebecca's identity came to light when Schultz accidentally discovered her hiding Hebrew prayer books in her apartment. Rather than being shocked or betrayed, Schultz found himself even more impressed by her courage and resourcefulness. He realized that the woman he had fallen in love with had been surviving by her wits in one of the most dangerous situations imaginable. Schultz's response to this discovery was immediate and decisive. He told Rebecca that he would do everything in his power to protect her, and that her safety was more important to him than his career or even his own life. This declaration marked the beginning of an elaborate deception that would last for the remainder of the war. Using his position in military logistics, Schultz created an entire false identity for Rebecca that went far beyond simple forged papers. He arranged for her to be listed as an essential worker in a military supply depot, giving her official protection from deportation. He provided her with detailed background information about her supposed Belgian Catholic identity, including family history, educational background, and personal details that would withstand scrutiny. But Schultz's protection went beyond paperwork. He used his knowledge of military operations to warn Rebecca about upcoming raids, searches, and security sweeps. He arranged for her to have access to safe houses when the situation became too dangerous. Most importantly, he provided her with the psychological support necessary to maintain her false identity under extreme stress. The relationship between Schultz and Rebecca evolved into a true partnership in survival. She used her intelligence and intuition to help him navigate the moral complexities of his position, while he used his military knowledge and authority to keep her safe. They developed an elaborate system of communication and emergency procedures that allowed them to maintain contact even during the most dangerous periods. One of the most critical tests of their system came during the massive deportation sweeps of 1943. Rebecca's name somehow appeared on a deportation list, despite her official protection as an essential worker. Schultz learned of this development just hours before the scheduled arrest, giving him almost no time to react. Working with desperate efficiency, Schultz arranged for Rebecca to be transferred to a different worksite immediately before the arrest team arrived. He then used his authority to have her name removed from the deportation list, claiming that she had been reassigned to a critical military project. The deception worked, but it required Schultz to call in favors and take risks that could have exposed his activities. The psychological toll of maintaining this deception was enormous for both of them. Schultz lived in constant fear that his activities would be discovered, knowing that exposure would mean death for both of them. Rebecca faced the daily stress of maintaining her false identity while living under the constant threat of discovery. Despite these pressures, their relationship not only survived, but deepened during the war years. The shared danger and the knowledge that they were willing to risk everything for each other created a bond that transcended the normal development of romantic relationships. They were not just lovers, but partners in the most dangerous game imaginable. Schultz's success in protecting Rebecca required him to become an expert in the bureaucratic machinery of the Nazi state. He learned to manipulate paperwork, exploit administrative loopholes, and navigate the complex web of military and civilian authorities. His position in logistics proved crucial, as it gave him access to information and resources that would have been unavailable to officers in other branches. The end of the war brought both relief and new challenges for Schultz and Rebecca. They had survived the Nazi period, but now faced the question of what to do with their relationship in the post-war world. Schultz had to account for his wartime service, while Rebecca had to decide whether to reclaim her Jewish identity or continue living as Marie Dubois. Their story had a remarkably positive outcome. After the war, Schultz was investigated by Allied authorities, but was ultimately cleared of war crimes charges, partly due to testimony from Rebecca and other Jews he had helped protect. The couple married in 1946 and emigrated to the United States, where they lived quietly for the remainder of their lives. A second case of successful protection involved Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a German police officer stationed in occupied Poland. Weber met Sarah Kowalski, a Jewish woman who had been passing as a Polish Catholic, when she was brought in for questioning during a routine identity check. Weber immediately suspected that her papers were forged, but instead of arresting her, he chose to let her go with a warning. Weber's decision to spare Sarah was initially based on instinct rather than romantic feeling. Something about her dignity and courage under interrogation impressed him, and he found himself hoping that she would escape detection. When she returned to thank him for his mercy, their relationship began to develop. Weber's protection of Sarah required different tactics than Schultz's protection of Rebecca. As a police officer, Weber had more direct authority over identity checks and arrests, but he also faced greater scrutiny from his superiors. He had to be extremely careful about when and how he provided protection, always ensuring that his actions appeared to be within the normal scope of his duties. The key to Weber's success was his ability to maintain the appearance of zealous efficiency while actually sabotaging the system from within. He became known among his colleagues as a thorough and dedicated officer, but he used this reputation to cover his protective activities. When Sarah's name appeared on arrest lists, Weber would claim that she had already been investigated and cleared. When other officers suspected her identity, Weber would vouch for her papers and background. Weber's protection of Sarah also involved helping other Jews in the area, both to provide cover for his special attention to her, and because her safety depended on the survival of the underground network that supported her false identity. He developed a reputation as an officer who was thorough but fair, which allowed him to provide warnings and assistance to Jewish families without attracting suspicion. The most dangerous test of Weber's protective abilities came during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. As the situation in Warsaw deteriorated, security measures throughout occupied Poland were intensified, creating additional risks for Jews living under false identities. Sarah's papers came under increased scrutiny, and Weber had to use all of his authority and influence to maintain her cover. Weber's success in protecting Sarah during this period required him to take unprecedented risks. He forged additional documents, created false employment records, and even arranged for Sarah to be temporarily relocated to a different city when the danger became too great. Each action required careful planning and precise execution, as a single mistake could have exposed both of them. The psychological stress of maintaining this deception for years took a severe toll on Weber. He developed what would today be recognized as chronic anxiety and depression, conditions that affected his sleep, appetite, and overall health. The constant fear of discovery, combined with the moral weight of his activities, created a psychological burden that was almost unbearable. Despite these challenges, Weber's commitment to protecting Sarah never wavered. He had made a fundamental moral choice that love and human decency were more important than political loyalty, and he maintained this commitment even when it threatened his own survival. His willingness to sacrifice everything for Sarah's safety demonstrated the transformative power of love in the face of absolute evil. The success of both Schultz and Weber in protecting the women they loved required not just courage and ingenuity, but also a deep understanding of the Nazi system and the ability to work within it while undermining it. They had to become experts in the machinery of oppression in order to protect their loved ones from its effects. Another remarkable case of successful protection involved Luftwaffe pilot Oberleutnant Hans Steiner, who met Eva Rosen in Vienna in 1940. Eva was a Jewish pianist who had been forced to give up her career when anti-Jewish laws were implemented in Austria. She was working as a domestic servant in a household where Steiner was a frequent guest. Steiner's relationship with Eva developed over many months of casual encounters at social gatherings and musical evenings. He was immediately impressed by her musical talent and her ability to discuss complex artistic and philosophical topics. When he learned of her Jewish background, his response was immediate and decisive. He would do everything possible to protect her. Using his position as a Luftwaffe officer, Steiner arranged for Eva to be issued false papers identifying her as the daughter of a deceased Austrian military officer. The fabricated identity was elaborate and detailed, including family records, educational background, and personal history that would withstand official scrutiny. Steiner's access to military records and his relationships with other officers allowed him to create a convincing false identity that protected Eva throughout the war. But Steiner's protection of Eva went beyond documentation. He used his military connections to arrange employment for her in positions that would provide both safety and cover for her activities. He helped her establish relationships with other Germans who were sympathetic to Jews, creating a network of protection that extended beyond his individual efforts. The relationship between Steiner and Eva evolved into a true partnership in resistance. Using her musical connections and his military position, they developed a system for helping other Jews escape Austria and reach safety in neutral countries. Their activities were carefully coordinated to avoid detection while maximizing their impact on Jewish survival. One of the most remarkable aspects of Steiner's protection of Eva was his ability to maintain his effectiveness as a military officer while simultaneously engaging in resistance activities. He continued to serve with distinction in the Luftwaffe, earning promotions and decorations while secretly working to undermine the regime he appeared to serve loyally. The psychological complexity of Steiner's situation was extraordinary. He had to maintain perfect composure while living a double life that could have resulted in his execution if discovered. The stress of maintaining this deception for years required exceptional psychological strength and unwavering commitment to his moral principles. The success of Steiner's protection of Eva was demonstrated not just by her survival, but by the survival of dozens of other Jews who benefited from their resistance network. Their activities saved lives, while also providing a model for how individual courage could make a difference even within the most oppressive system. These cases of successful protection reveal several common factors. The men involved held positions that gave them access to information and authority. They were willing to take extraordinary risks. They developed sophisticated systems of deception and protection, and they had the psychological strength to maintain their activities over extended periods under extreme stress. Perhaps most importantly, these men had the support and partnership of remarkably courageous women who were willing to trust them with their lives. The success of these relationships depended on mutual trust, shared commitment, and the ability to work together in the face of overwhelming danger. The stories of Germans who fell in love with Jewish women during the Holocaust reveal the full spectrum of human response to moral crisis. Some chose courage over compliance, risking everything to protect the women they loved. Others attempted impossible compromises, trying to reconcile love with loyalty to a genocidal regime. Still others chose ideology over love, with devastating consequences for all involved. These relationships occurred in the context of history's most systematic campaign of dehumanization and murder. They reveal both the remarkable persistence of human connection in the face of absolute evil and the terrible cost of attempting to love across the lines of genocide. Each story represents a unique response to an impossible situation, shaped by individual character, circumstances, and the particular pressures of time and place. The men who chose to protect Jewish women faced extraordinary challenges that tested every aspect of their character. They had to overcome years of ideological indoctrination, risk their careers and lives, and develop sophisticated systems of deception and protection. Most importantly, they had to maintain their commitment over extended periods under extreme psychological stress. Those who attempted to find middle ground between love and loyalty often found themselves psychologically destroyed by the impossibility of serving both masters. Their stories reveal the futility of attempting to reconcile genuine human connection with genocidal ideology. Perhaps most tragically, those who ultimately chose ideology over love found no peace in their decision. Even when they convinced themselves that duty required them to betray the women they loved, they were haunted by guilt and regret that often proved more destructive than the original moral conflict. The rare cases of successful protection required not just individual courage, but also the development of sophisticated networks of support and deception. These men had to become experts in the machinery of oppression in order to protect their loved ones from its effects. Their success depended on their ability to work within the system while undermining it, maintaining the appearance of loyalty while actually engaging in resistance. These stories remind us that even in the darkest periods of history, individual human beings faced moral choices that define their character and determine their legacy. The Holocaust was not just a collective tragedy, but also a series of individual decisions made by millions of people who chose between courage and compliance, love and hatred, resistance and collaboration. The German men who fell in love with Jewish women during this period faced perhaps the most extreme version of moral choice imaginable. Their responses reveal both the potential for human goodness in the face of absolute evil and the terrible cost of attempting to love across the lines of genocide. Their stories serve as both inspiration and warning, reminding us of the power of individual choice, even in the most impossible circumstances. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.